In 2018, Serena Williams played in a US Open final under conditions almost nobody else in sports has ever faced, just over a year removed from a childbirth that nearly killed her, having developed a pulmonary embolism so severe that doctors later said she came close to dying on the delivery table. She lost that final, in a match remembered less for the tennis than for a heated dispute with the chair umpire that played out in front of a global audience. The clips of that argument circulated widely. What circulated far less was what she did in the weeks and months that followed, a period that reveals far more about her actual approach to adversity than any single match. Across more than 2 decades at the absolute top of a brutally individual sport, Serena Williams built a body of work defined less by the absence of failure, which is impossible at that level over that many years, and more by an unusually disciplined relationship to failure itself. It's worth being precise about what a career at the top of professional tennis actually involves, because the public narrative tends to remember the championships and forget the losses that surrounded them. Across more than 25 years of professional competition, Williams lost hundreds of matches, many of them on the largest stages in the sport, broadcast to hundreds of millions of people, often followed immediately by a microphone shoved in her face demanding an explanation. This is a fundamentally different kind of failure than most people ever have to manage. Not private, not contained, but immediate, public, and endlessly replayed. What distinguished her across this span wasn't an absence of visible frustration in the moment. She was, by her own admission, an intensely emotional competitor. What distinguished her was the speed and consistency with which she returned to competitive form afterward. Devastating losses, including several major final defeats that would have ended many careers psychologically, were reliably followed not by prolonged decline but by renewed, often record-setting periods of dominance. This pattern, repeated across more than 2 decades, suggests something more deliberate than natural toughness. It suggests a practiced discipline. In interviews across her career, Williams returned repeatedly to a distinction that maps closely onto Stoic thinking, even though she rarely framed it in explicitly philosophical terms. She spoke often about treating a loss as information about a single match rather than as a verdict on her ability or worth as a competitor. This sounds simple to state and is notoriously difficult to actually practice, particularly under the magnification of global media attention actively constructing narratives about decline or failure after every defeat. The Stoic framing for this is the distinction between what is and isn't within your control. The outcome of a tennis match depends on dozens of variables outside any single player's control: an opponent's exceptional day, a bad call, injury, weather, the specific bounce of a ball at a critical point. What remains within a competitor's control is preparation, effort, and the response to whatever the outcome turns out to be. Williams's longevity, competing at an elite level into her late 30s in a sport that typically sees players decline a decade earlier, is difficult to explain without crediting this underlying discipline. A competitor who internalized every loss as a referendum on her fundamental worth would not have been able to sustain the motivation required to keep returning, year after year, to a sport that, by its structure, guarantees frequent and very public failure. Williams has spoken directly about working with sports psychologists and treating mental preparation with the same structured seriousness as physical conditioning, rather than treating mental toughness as a fixed trait some athletes simply have and others don't. This reflects a broader shift in elite sport generally, but she was an early and consistent advocate for it specifically. The implication is significant. If mental composure under pressure is trainable, the same way a serve or a backhand is trainable, then it is not a mysterious gift available only to a fortunate few. It's a skill, developed through deliberate, sustained practice, the same way physical skill is built. This connects directly to Epictetus's own teaching method, which was fundamentally practical rather than theoretical, built around daily exercises designed to train the mind's response to difficulty the way physical exercise trains the body. Williams's career suggests the same underlying principle, tested under modern, hyper-public conditions Epictetus could not have imagined, but governed by the same basic mechanism. The mind's relationship to adversity is not fixed. It can be deliberately, systematically trained. Williams has not, to public knowledge, described herself as a student of Stoic philosophy in the direct, documented way Stockdale or Bruce Lee did. What makes her relevant to this series is the degree to which her career, examined closely, demonstrates the practical application of Stoic principles under conditions of sustained, repeated, public failure, a kind of adversity that is in some ways harder to manage than a single dramatic crisis, precisely because it recurs constantly, for decades, with no end point in sight. The dichotomy of control, applied not once but hundreds of times across a career, the discipline of returning to form after public defeat, the treatment of mental composure as a trainable skill rather than a fixed trait, all of these are Stoic mechanisms operating in a thoroughly modern context. Her example matters partly because it demonstrates these principles operating not under the extreme, singular conditions of a prison camp or a concentration camp, but under the more mundane, repeated pressure that most people, in much smaller ways, actually have to manage in their own lives, professional setbacks, public mistakes, repeated disappointment in pursuit of a long-term goal. Here's something to try this week, drawn directly from this episode. After your next setback, however small, a mistake at work, a difficult conversation that didn't go well, a goal you didn't reach, try Williams's distinction directly. Write down, briefly, what the outcome actually was, stated as plainly and factually as possible. Then write down, separately, what it would mean if this outcome was simply information about this one specific attempt, rather than a verdict on your overall ability or worth. Notice how different those two framings feel, and notice that the facts of the situation are identical in both cases, only the interpretation has changed. This is the same separation Williams appears to have practiced, deliberately, across hundreds of public defeats over more than 2 decades, treating each one as data to incorporate rather than as evidence about who she fundamentally was. The skill is not avoiding the disappointment of the loss itself. It's preventing that disappointment from compounding into something larger and more corrosive than the single event actually warrants. Next week, we'll look at another figure who turned sustained, unglamorous daily effort into one of the most significant bodies of work in modern history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.